something extraordinary happened just moments ago, and the ripple effects are already being felt from Washington to Beijing, from the frozen tundra of Alaska all the way to the halls of Parliament in Ottawa. The geopolitical chessboard just shifted in a way that nobody in the White House saw coming, and tonight, the story is moving faster than the news cycle can contain it. Let's start with what we know. Mark Carney, the newly elected Prime Minister of Canada, a man who spent decades as one of the most respected central bankers on the planet, has just made a move that is sending shockwaves through every financial market, every diplomatic back channel, and every strategy room in the Western world. Carney has announced a sweeping redirection of Canadian trade and investment, a package estimated at roughly $780 billion away from the United States and toward China and a broader coalition of non-American trading partners, $780 billion. Let that number sit with you for a moment. That is not a rounding error. That is not a negotiating bluff. That is a tectonic shift in the economic architecture of North America as we have known it for generations. And here in Washington, the reaction inside the Trump administration is, by multiple accounts, one of barely contained fury. Sources familiar with internal White House discussions describe a president who did not see this coming at the scale it arrived. A president who believed, as he has said publicly and repeatedly, that Canada needed the United States far more than the United States needed Canada. That calculation, at least for now, appears to have been catastrophically wrong. To understand how we got here, we have to go back just a few months, because the seeds of this moment were planted in the very early days of the second Trump administration. When Donald Trump returned to the White House, he arrived with an economic nationalism that was, if anything, more aggressive than his first term. Tariffs were not just a tool, they were a worldview. And Canada, America's largest trading partner, sharing the longest undefended border in the world, was not exempted from that worldview. In fact, Canada was, in many ways, made an early example. Trump imposed sweeping tariffs on Canadian steel, aluminum, lumber, and eventually on a broad range of consumer goods. He mused publicly and dangerously about Canada becoming the 51st state, comments that were received in Ottawa not as jokes but as something more menacing, a signal of how the most powerful man in the world was thinking about his northern neighbor. Canadian politicians across the political spectrum, conservatives and liberals alike, began to speak in language that Canadians have rarely used about the United States. Language about sovereignty, language about dignity, language about the need, perhaps for the first time in living memory, to fundamentally reconsider the relationship. And then Mark Carney won. And Mark Carney is not a man who speaks before he has done the math. He ran the Bank of Canada during the 2008 financial crisis. He ran the Bank of England through Brexit. He has sat across tables from the most powerful financial minds in the world, and he has never blinked. When Carney campaigned on reorienting Canada's economic relationships, the political establishment in Washington largely dismissed it as campaign rhetoric. They should not have dismissed it, because Carney meant every single word. What Carney announced is not merely a trade policy, it is a strategic doctrine. Canada is formally accelerating its trade diversification, signing new frameworks with the European Union, deepening partnerships with Japan and South Korea, and most dramatically, entering into a series of agreements with China that cover everything from critical minerals to clean energy technology to agricultural exports. Canada sits on some of the most extraordinary natural resource wealth in the entire world. Uranium, lithium, nickel, cobalt. The very materials that the clean energy transition and the artificial intelligence revolution both depend upon desperately. And Carney has just told Beijing and told the world that Canada is open for business in ways it was not before. For China, this is a gift that almost defies belief. Beijing has been watching the Trump administration's aggressive tariff posture push ally after ally toward the exits, and China has been positioning itself as the alternative, the stable hand, the reliable partner. Canada is not a small prize. Canada is a G7 nation with an extraordinary resource base, a highly educated workforce, and deep integration into global financial systems. Bringing Canada closer into its orbit, even partially, is a diplomatic coup of the first order for Beijing, and Chinese state media has already begun celebrating accordingly. Now let's talk about Alaska, because the Alaska dimension of this story is one that has received far less attention than it deserves, and it is in some ways the most viscerally dramatic part of the entire unfolding situation. The Trump administration has been pushing aggressively to expand energy production in Alaska. Oil drilling on federal lands, expanded natural gas extraction, the revival of projects that had been paused or canceled under the Biden administration. The theory was straightforward: American energy dominance, cheap fuel, economic growth, political wins in a red state that loves its resource economy. But here's the problem. Getting Alaskan energy to market at scale requires infrastructure, and a significant portion of the most viable infrastructure routes for moving Alaskan natural gas, in particular, pass through or depend upon cooperation with Canada. That cooperation has now effectively frozen. Canadian officials, emboldened by Carney's mandate and by the wave of nationalist sentiment that has swept through their country in response to Trump's tariffs and his 51st state comments, are in no mood to facilitate American energy projects that benefit Washington, while Ottawa is being economically punished. Pipeline negotiations that were quietly proceeding have stalled. Permitting discussions have gone cold. And certain infrastructure projects on which Alaskan producers were counting have now been thrown into profound uncertainty. There is a cruel irony here that is almost Shakespearean in its structure. Trump wanted to use economic pressure to bring Canada to heel. Instead, that pressure has produced a Canadian government with a historic mandate and a world-class economist at its helm, who has used that pressure as the justification to pivot away from the United States in ways that could echo for decades. And in doing so, Canada has inadvertently frozen some of the very American energy ambitions that were supposed to be one of Trump's signature second-term achievements. Inside the Republican Party, there are members who are deeply alarmed. Not all Republicans are comfortable with a trade war against America's closest neighbor and oldest ally. The agricultural states that depend on Canadian markets, the manufacturing corridors that are woven into cross-border supply chains, the energy sector that needs Canadian cooperation. These are not Democratic constituencies. These are core Trump constituencies. And they are beginning to feel the pain in ways that translate into phone calls to congressional offices and into quiet, worried conversations that are not yet happening in public but are happening nonetheless behind closed doors. Rachel Maddow has been tracking this story with the kind of sustained, methodical attention that it demands. Because what Maddow has been making clear night after night is that the story of Trump and Canada is not primarily a trade story. It is a story about American power and its limits. It is a story about what happens when the world's most powerful country decides to treat its friends the way it has historically treated its adversaries. And the answer, as we are seeing in real time, is that friends start making other friends. The $780 billion figure is significant not just in its size, but in its symbolism. It is Canada saying, in the most concrete financial language available, that the relationship with the United States is being repriced. That Canadian resources, Canadian investment, Canadian partnership, all of these things that Washington took for granted for generations, all of these things have a price, and that price now includes respect, reciprocity, and the kind of stable, rules-based engagement that the Trump administration has repeatedly declined to offer. Diplomats who have spent their careers working on the Canada-US relationship are using words like historic rupture and generational reset. These are people who are not prone to hyperbole. These are people who have seen trade disputes come and go, who have watched administrations push and pull at the bilateral relationship and always watched it snap back into alignment because the underlying interests were too powerful to deny. What they are saying now is that something different is happening. That the combination of the tariffs, the 51st state rhetoric, and now the Canadian response has created a dynamic that will not simply resolve itself when a new administration takes office or when political temperatures cool. Because China is not going to give back what it is gaining right now. The investments being structured, the partnerships being formalized, the supply chain relationships being built, these have a momentum of their own. Once Canadian lithium is flowing to Chinese battery manufacturers under long-term contracts that doesn't simply reverse because an American president decides to be nicer. Once Canadian diplomatic bandwidth is invested in deepening relationships with Beijing and Brussels and Tokyo, that bandwidth is not infinitely available to be redirected back to Washington on short notice. The architecture of economic relationships, once redrawn, tends to stay redrawn. And Alaska sits there, vast and cold and resource-rich, watching its economic future become entangled in a diplomatic crisis that was entirely avoidable, that was produced not by any conflict of fundamental interests, but by a theory of dominance that turned out to be, in practice, self-defeating. What happens next is genuinely uncertain. The Trump administration faces a choice. It can escalate further, piling more tariffs and more pressure onto Canada, betting that economic pain will eventually bring Carney to the table on American terms. But Carney has already shown that pressure produces in him not capitulation but strategic pivot. Every escalation gives him more domestic political cover to push further and faster in the direction he was already heading. Or the administration can seek some form of de-escalation, some negotiated framework that gives both sides a face-saving path toward a more stable relationship. But that requires something this White House has consistently struggled to do: treat another country as a genuine equal with legitimate interests of its own. Tonight, across Canada, there is something that political observers are describing as a genuine sense of national purpose, a feeling that the country is finally standing up in a way that matches its own self-image. Carney's approval numbers, already elevated from his election victory, are rising further. The political cost of confronting Washington, which every previous Canadian government feared above almost all others, has turned out to be, at least for now, a political benefit. Canadians are proud, and that pride is a political fact that will outlast any individual trade negotiation. And tonight across Washington, in the think tanks and the policy shops and the offices of senators who are trying to figure out what to tell their agricultural constituents, there is a reckoning underway. A reckoning with the possibility that the theory of the case was wrong, that leverage, applied without restraint and without respect, does not always produce submission. Sometimes it produces exactly the opposite. Sometimes it produces a Mark Carney standing before the world and signing $780 billion worth of agreements with your most formidable strategic competitor. The story is not over. It is in many ways just beginning. But the opening chapter has been written, and it has not been written the way the White House expected. Alaska is frozen, the money is moving east, and the world is watching to see what America does next. Stay with us. This one is far from finished.